Hey guys, what's up? It's Clay. Welcome back to another episode. Today I'm going to jump into the very light topic of morality, and specifically the source of morality. It's actually something that comes up quite a bit when I talk to people. I seem to get into a lot of discussions with people about their beliefs, about religion, kind of the philosophy of it all. And it actually seems like one thing that Christians in particular get a little hung up about. They will say, how do you justify the existence of morality without God? Can morals exist without this, being up in the sky with a yardstick saying, do this or else? So first of all, maybe I'll just define what morality is. So here's an actual dictionary definition. Morality is principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. So it's basically the ability to tell the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. It seems like a fairly general consensus that most Christians would say, without God, there is no real difference between right and wrong. It's God that defines that for us. And if that went away, if the Bible went away, if this sort of rule book or code of conduct went away, how would we know how to act? And then the general conclusion from that question is that there is no reason to act morally unless there's a God. So it seems to me that you can put the opinions on this topic into two main categories. On one hand, you have the religious view, which says, I want to do good because I'm being told to do it. And there might be a threat of punishment behind that. If I don't do it, I will be punished. Or there could be a reward behind it. If I do it, I will get this good thing. So that's the religious view of morality. The non-religious view of morality would be, I want to do good because I believe it is the right thing to do, or I believe that it is good. So there's something inside of me that says that's good. The funny thing about that second one is a lot of times Christians or other theists may say, well, that's God. That's God putting that inside of you. So even though you don't believe in God, just so you know, that is in there because he gave it to you. So in general, Christians, Muslims, other theistic religions, they see themselves as very moral. They almost see themselves as the arbitrators of morality. So I found this study, and they actually tested morality amongst different groups of people. And right off the bat, there was something that they found that was kind of interesting, and I'll just read it here. It's a little paragraph. When researchers ask people to report their own behaviors and attitude, religious individuals claim to be more altruistic, compassionate, honest, civic, and charitable than non-religious ones. Even among twins, more religious siblings describe themselves as being more generous. So I think this is really interesting. So you've got these two groups of people, the religious and the non-religious. Right off the bat, the religious are describing themselves as more moral than the non-religious group. So my question is, of the two sides, the first being, I do right because I'm told to do it, versus I do right because I believe it's true, almost like an instinct. My question is, which of those is the more morally bankrupt statement? It seems obvious to me that if you don't know what right or wrong is unless someone tells you, but that seems to me more morally bankrupt than the person who says, I'm doing right because it feels right, or I believe it to be right. So Christians will say, well, you actually have no reason to do the right thing. They'll say that to an atheist. And, I've always thought this was a really interesting statement if you really step back. So it's like, oh, I see. So the only reason that you're not just killing me right now and killing my whole family and killing my kids, maybe raping people or stealing money, the only reason you're not doing that is because you've got this threat of punishment, or there's some God telling you not to do it. And if it wasn't for that, you would go and do those bad things. Is that what you're saying to me? So one of the more interesting things to me about this whole thing, when Christians say that they are more moral, is it seems like that statement would be easy to test. And we've got 2,000 years of history of Christianity that we can test that theory. Are Christians more moral, meaning they can tell the difference between right and wrong? Therefore, they choose right more often than people who don't believe. When we look back in history, what do we see? So it seems to me right off the bat, if you found a country that was less religious versus a country that was more religious, technically speaking, you should see more moral behavior in the religious country and less moral behavior than in the less religious country. So I actually looked up the stats. I found the least religious countries and the most religious countries. So it turns out actually China is the least religious country, by this believing in a God, I think is how they defined it. But there's other philosophies in China that almost seem a little religious, so I decided to skip China. Anyway, I discovered that Sweden is one of the least religious countries out there. A bunch of Northern European countries, actually. So Sweden at 78% non-religious, Belgium 72% non-religious, the UK is 73, Czech Republic 76, but Sweden took the prize there at 78%. So, only 22% consider themselves religious in Sweden. So compare that to Canada, where I live, 63% non-religious. In the United States, only 43% non-religious, with only 7% of those people that consider themselves non-religious, 7% would call themselves convinced atheists. One thing I've noticed among Christians is it seems a little bit fashionable sometimes to be like, well, I'm not a Christian or I'm not religious, and they kind of define themselves in this non-religious sense. But then if you really get down to it and start asking some questions, they still believe in Jesus, they still believe in following Jesus. So I think this is a kind of a telling stat right here, that 43% are non-religious in the United States, but only 7% are a convinced atheist. So you've got this pretty large group of people that they're not calling themselves atheists, but they're not calling themselves religious. They're kind of, somewhere in the middle. And the word religious kind of has some negative connotations these days to a lot of people. So I kind of get why maybe people don't really want to be associated with that, even if they might call themselves a Christ follower. So if the Christian theory is correct that, being religious makes you more moral, it seems to me that right off the bat, we should be able to look at some of these countries that are less religious, and we should see less moral behavior. So I was trying to do some searching on like crime rates, gun violence, percent GDP donated to charities. How do they take care of their homeless, like their healthcare system? Do they provide support to the most vulnerable in their communities? So you can probably see where I'm going with this. The United States, being one of the more religious countries, kind of gets failing grades in a lot of these issues like crime rates and gun violence, and how do they take care of their homeless, and do they support their citizens and take care of their citizens' health? So I don't really want this to get political and whether healthcare should be a right, a public service to everybody. In Canada, obviously healthcare is covered by our taxes, and it doesn't matter if you're on the street and you're homeless, or if you've got $1 billion in the bank, you can go to the doctor and they will help you. Obviously not like that in the United States. If you don't have health insurance, I'm no expert on the United States healthcare system, but pretty sure you got to pay a lot of money, or you need private health insurance, or you need to work for a company. So if you're poor or you're on the street, sometimes, or a lot of times maybe, you don't have a lot of options. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. But I do know that if you look at some of these less religious countries like Sweden, Norway, in general, they have less violence than the United States. They have lower crime rates. They have, it seems to me, a more peaceful society. There's this more desire to take care of each other, take care of everybody's health, even if they don't have money to pay. I guess I'm not seeing evidence that the United States, for example, is more moral than Norway. In fact, it almost seems a little bit the opposite. So I might piss some people off from the US here. Not my intention. I'm just trying to look at the stats here. And so far, from looking at these stats, it almost seems like an inverse correlation. So the more religious, the worse off they are in some of these areas. So when we look in the past, we've got 2,000 years of Christianity. If we actually look at the times where Christianity gained power, they were in control of the government, in the control of nations, were those times more peaceful, more loving, more giving, more moral, I guess? I think it's pretty clear from looking at history that when the Christians were in power, maybe in the Middle Ages, basically the governments, the kingdoms were controlled by the church in a way. Most of the people in power were Christians, and it was sort of imposed on the people. I mean, those were some of the darkest, bloodiest times we've had in history. You had the church and the government burning people at the stake in the name of God. I mean, all the holy wars and all the bloodshed that happened. To me, it seems like a pretty funny statement to say that being a Christian in the last 2,000 years made you more moral. If anybody has any examples of Christians doing things that just were so out of reach of somebody who's not a Christian or not religious, post it in the comments. So as a thought experiment, think about a group of Christians in your town. What are they doing? Are they doing things that are inexplicable from a moral perspective? And by that I mean, you drive by them and you go, wow, they're so honest, they're so compassionate, they're so non-judgmental, they're so helpful, they're so empathetic. There's literally no explanation for how amazing they are. What is their secret? Because the interesting thing is when you look at these studies, that's sort of how Christians think of themselves. But now that I'm kind of on the other side of things, it's kind of a funny thing. When I think of Christians, what do I think? I think concerts. I think people in buildings having parties and get-togethers and having fun together and enjoying the music, having a motivational talk, and then going out and basically living like everybody else. But I guess I'm having trouble seeing that these people are really any different than, other people in society. All right, so the next problem I see with the statement that religion makes you more moral is that oftentimes religious people can't agree on what is actually moral. So it kind of puts them into this funny spot. If morality comes from religion, from God, then it should be obvious. It should be clear, I guess. But it seems to me that quite often Christians can't really agree. So what are some examples? In the 19th century, Mormons considered polygamy to be a moral imperative. And by imperative, I mean important, vital, something that should be done. So literally, Mormons felt that polygamy was important from a moral perspective. And on the other side, you've got the Catholics who believe it was pretty much a mortal sin. So here's two groups, both religious, both claiming to follow a God, yet they've come to opposite ideas of what is moral in the situation. So at one point in the United States, it was moral to own slaves, and lots of Christians owned slaves, and there was lots of justification. I mean, just in the Bible alone, you can actually make a case for the morality of owning slaves. It's actually one of the biggest problems I have with the Bible. I feel like if it really was a timeless text, if it was God, truly communicating his vision for the world, why wouldn't he condemn slavery in the very beginning? He chose not to. And then so all these people thought it was completely fine to have slaves. I actually spoke with somebody not too long ago. It was really eye-opening because it was the first Christian that I had spoke to that's basically still of the opinion that slavery is completely fine within Christianity, even today. I mean, most Christians will condemn slavery, but I was sort of half delighted in a way because I actually had met a person that was arguing for slavery, because in a lot of ways I almost have to agree with them. When I look at the Bible, it doesn't seem to condemn slavery. And in other places it talks about how to treat your slaves. So obviously to me, slavery is morally deplorable. It seems awful to try to justify slavery as a moral action. But the thing is, go back a few hundred years ago, and there's lots of Christians that would justify it. So you have these two drastically different opinions of what morality is, based on the same religious text even. So to me, that's interesting. Well, what's really determining morality here? It's an interpretation of the text. And the funny thing about it is everybody always assumes they have the right interpretation, and they don't really find out until later that their interpretation was wrong. So in any given moment, can you really know that your interpretation of the Bible, of what is moral or what is not moral, what is right and wrong, how can you really know that that interpretation is true and that it won't change sometime in the future? So I had this other example. Maybe you've heard me talk in my Christianity videos about Martin Luther. I really don't like the guy. He's the guy that essentially created Protestantism. So we had the Catholic Church, and then the Protestants broke off from the Catholics, and there was a whole ton of bloodshed as this happened. You know, Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics, you know, all in the name of Jesus. So I'm going to read this one for you. In 1543, Martin Luther, one of the fathers of Protestantism, published a document called On the Jews and Their Lies, echoing anti-Semitic sentiments that have been common amongst various religious groups for centuries. So here, today, we would think it was wrong to be anti-Semitic, for example. Most Christians would believe that. But here is the guy who literally invented Protestantism, as we know it today, very anti-Semitic. So, which is it? Which is the right here? Which is the wrong? It seems that over time, the opinion of that has changed. So an example from the Anglican Church, it used to be immoral to use any kind of birth control. Now they've changed their mind on that. So, that was wrong, now it's right. In that same church, women used to not be allowed to be leaders or ministers, now they are. They are blessing same-sex unions now, the Anglican Church. Many other churches condemn it, and they would never bless a same-sex union. You've got people in the United States that are trying to create laws to prevent gay people from getting married. So you've got these two types of Christians now. On one side, they're saying being gay is wrong, you're going to hell. But then these other churches that have kind of moved along with culture and are blessing same-sex unions. I mean, who's right? I guess my point of bringing these examples up is just to show that Christians can't even agree what's moral according to their own religious code, according to what God has said in the Bible, apparently. If they can't even agree about what's right and wrong, why should we trust their opinion of what's right and wrong? I guess would be my question. So going back to that study I mentioned, I want to read something else here that I thought was really, really interesting. So what they did was they got a bunch of religious people, a bunch of non-religious people, and they asked them how to describe themselves first. So I read that other bit earlier. I'll read it again just really quick. So when researchers asked people to report on their own behaviors and attitudes, religious individuals claim to be more altruistic, compassionate, honest, civic, and charitable than non-religious ones. Even among twins, more religious siblings describe themselves as being more generous. So then what they did was they actually looked at the actual behaviors. Here's this group that claims to be much more moral than this group. Are they actually more moral? It seems easy to measure, right? You just look at their actions. So here's a quote that I found about that study. In a classical experiment known as the Good Samaritan study, researchers monitored who would stop to help an injured person lying in an alley. So here you've got an injured person lying in an alley. Perfect example, a perfect opportunity for a Christian to kind of prove their generosity, prove their altruism. I guess, I bet if you ask Christians, they would expect that Christians would help that person more often than non-Christians or non-religious people. So in the study, they found that religiosity played no role in helping behavior. Even when participants were on their way to deliver a talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So yeah, basically the end result of this study is that there really is no difference for moral behavior between religious and non-religious groups. But it does seem like the religious group thinks there is. So that is one perplexing thing. I think maybe they've been told so often that they're more moral, that they probably just believe it, and then it just gets repeated. So in the end, basically, the study concluded that there is no evidence that religious people behave more morally. So some religious people will come along at this point and say, well, the reason why the non-religious people behave just as well as the religious people is that God has imprinted morality upon those people. We are all image bearers of Christ. That's what the Bible says. We were made in the image of God. I think my biggest question with this is, well, what about the animals? How do you really define the difference between morality and instinct? And I believe I've talked about this in other videos, but I'm going to go over it again. So to me, there seems to be a perfectly natural explanation why human beings want to cooperate with each other. And it's the same reason why any species wants to cooperate with each other. Like, take a pack of wolves. Why do they get along? Why do they form this community and they have this hierarchy and they all seem to get along? And if one member misbehaves, there's probably some repercussions for that member. It seems to be very ordered. Are they just ripping each other apart? They don't have a God. They don't believe in God, yet they still behave morally. Correct? So my observation with regards to morality in general is it seems a little coincidental that morality often seems to align perfectly with what makes us survive and thrive. And all species are like that. So humans are very community-driven. Very tribal. And if you actually look back in history, like let's say we go back to like hunter-gatherer times, they say around 50,000 years ago, a lone human was much more likely to not make it, be killed, be eaten, not survive, die of starvation. A lone human was essentially a dead human. Human beings survived much better in groups. So human beings naturally formed communities. They would hunt together, they would protect each other together, they would find food together, and as a result, they would take care of each other because their survival relied on this community. If you went against the rules, let's say you murdered somebody, maybe you would get banished from that community and sent out to the tundra by yourself, at which point you'd probably die. So the basic rules of natural selection are an individual that survives and gets to reproduce and gets to pass on their DNA to future generations. Whatever made that individual survive is more likely to be passed on to the offspring. It turns out that community is what helps those animals survive best. The better your reputation is, maybe the higher social standing you'll have, maybe the more access you'll have to reproduce and pass your DNA on and have strong, healthy offspring that also survive. So one other thing that kind of supports this theory that moral behavior is based on what makes you survive is you can see human beings when a tribe is threatened. They will clearly do deplorable things in the name of their own survival. So, take World War II. Germany is trying to take over all of Europe. Japan joins in. Eventually, the Allies were so threatened, they actually came to the point, and the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities. These were not military targets. They dropped them on civilian cities, killed tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. Is that a moral thing? Here you've got this country that is made up, even back then, was even more religious. Even Hitler's army was very religious. Actually, they say, if you actually look up the stats for this, Hitler's army was one of the most religious armies ever, the most Christian. Ironically, in order to get into the SS, which was that kind of elite military group within the German military, in order to get into that, you had to be a Christian of some kind. Atheists weren't allowed into the SS, and the SS were the ones that were responsible for a lot of horrible stuff, killing people because they wouldn't join up, and the ultimate, killing of millions of Jews. So It seems clear that human beings are willing to put their morality aside if it means protecting their own survival. I mean, you can see this even with home invasions and things like that. There's many Christians who would say, well, someone comes into my house, I'm allowed to blow them away with this shotgun. And they can do that while claiming to follow a teacher that says, love your enemy as yourself. Can you kill your enemy while you're loving them? To me, it seems like a contradiction. Many Christians seem to have no problem with that contradiction. But yeah, I'm not really sure how to reconcile that. So one more thought on this video. This is not a new topic. This has been discussed for actually thousands of years. So I actually found this quote from Socrates. It was a discussion he was having. And so this is like ancient Greece. This is how long this has been going on for. And the question was, does God command the particular action because it is morally right? Or is it morally right because God commands it? And this question is such an amazing question. And there's a reason why Socrates is famous. I think it really puts this whole religious moral argument kind of on the rocks, and I'll explain why. Quite commonly, Christians like to think of God as the ultimate judge, the ultimate arbitrator of right and wrong. And so God almost speaks morals into existence. So the next question is, could it be moral to kill babies for fun if he said it was moral? Would you be okay with that as a Christian if he said that? I think instantly most of us that would grind with us and say, well, no, but God would never do that. But that's not the point. The point is, could he do it? If he did it, would it now make it moral? It seems to me the answer to that would be no. Even if a God said that something like that was the right thing to do, I, for one, couldn't go along with that. I couldn't get on board with that. So the only other alternative is that there exists this moral system outside of God, and God is just speaking it to us. But of course, the problem with that is that if that is true, then God isn't the ultimate arbitrator of morality. He doesn't decide. There's something above God, to which the next question has to be, well, where did that come from? And what is this system that controls God? Christians don't like that. They don't like the thought that there's something outside of God that controls God. So really the only thing they can say is that something is right or wrong simply because God says so. So yeah, just something interesting from Socrates that I thought kind of applied to this, and just proof that this conversation has been going on for thousands of years, and it'll probably continue to go on thousands of years. Nothing that I've said in this video today is going to end this discussion, that's for sure. But I thought I would talk about it. At the very least, the next time somebody says this to me, I can send them this video and say, here's my thoughts on it. Anyway, guys, thanks for checking out the video. If you have any thoughts of your own on this, feel free to put them in the comments, or if you have questions. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day. Thanks a lot. See ya.